Harbert. Hi.
Hello,
You're,
Serge.
you're both a focuser and a Quaker. And over the years, you've paid a lot of attention to the similarities and differences.
Yes. Would you like me to start?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I wanted to start by talking about an early connection between focusing and Quaker practice on the part of Gene Gendlin. As a young man, he actually attended Quaker meeting in Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker retreat center in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And reflecting back, this is well after he developed focusing. He said, focusing arises from a deep tradition that Quakers preserve for the world. So again, focusing arises from within a deep tradition that Quakers preserve for the world. So I think, in fact, I'm convinced that Gendlin understood that a key part of Quaker practice was actually finding, speaking, and acting from a felt sense. So this has led me to look more closely at the connection between the two practices. A dozen or so years ago, I was engaged in what we call Quaker meditation, and the question I was wrestling with was, well, what is my role in Quakers? I was troubled not having a clear sense of what I could or what I could do. And so in meditation, as I went inside and asked that question, what came to me was a visual image of a grassy area, and on it was an old, looked like parchment map, and people were gathered around. I took them to be Quakers, and they were pointing at the map, and then the words came to me, old into new. And that with that, I felt a felt shift, relaxed, and I had the idea of what my role might be, and that was to actually map Quaker language, which is about 370 years old, into Gendlin's language, which we'll say is 20 or 25 years old. Doing that, mapping the languages lets me speak about Quaker practice in a modern experiential way. And also the reverse case is true. Mapping Gendlin into Quaker language lets me extend and apply Gendlin's philosophical concepts to group settings, which is the focus of Quaker practice. So I had the answer to my question, and I've been working with it ever since.
Yeah, yeah. But so it's interesting to see. It was a question itself, the answer to the question, and then we're going to get more into the meat of it as we go on with this discussion. Mm-hmm. But there's also that you ask the question, and the way of asking the question was the form of a meditation, which is an allowing of making space for things to come up. There is something in it that is about the value of that kind of listening.
True. It's interesting, the Quaker expression for that experience and process is called a leading.
A lead-in?
Leading, which is, I think, more expressive of the unfolding of the felt sense as it comes about over time. These are often quite strong experiences, and it takes time and effort to work out. So again, the Quaker expression, leading, which is a key expression for Quakers, sort of captures that sense.
But the entry point into the process at which it starts unfolding.
Exactly. And which continues to unfold. Again, in Genlin's terms, you go back to it. It's like going back to a spring or a refreshing sense of life itself. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And so what came up for you is mapping the old into the new, and actually also and vice versa. So
yes.
to see the similarities and differences in the
Yes.
two approaches.
So I'd like to move on to the similarities.
Mhm.
I called it Quaker meditation, which is actually quite new. Uh, Early Quakers, and for long periods of time, didn't write down what they were doing in meeting when they rose to speak or when they acted, and so it was only recently, actually about 20 years ago, that a UK Quaker, Rex Ambler, had his own spiritual crisis and was working on a book on an anthology of the writings of George Fox, an early Quaker. And he worked out or reconstructed what he called a Quaker meditation. This is a 4-step process, and I'll just give you the 4 steps. And this is the meditation that I used. It's called Mind the Light is the first step, and that's the light within. So that's an inward turning. Open your heart to the truth. Wait in the light, and then submit to the truth. So when Ambler did that, he found he could get to this space that we get to in focusing, and was able to resolve his spiritual crisis. What's interesting is that he talked to a psychologist friend and told him or her about what he had found, and she said, that sounds like a lot like focusing.
Hmm.
So we've come full circle. Ambler got a copy of Genlin's focusing book, and then found he could get to the same place using the classical 6-step focusing. So now we have the commonality of a 4-step Quaker meditation, which is actually done as a group meditation. It takes about 40 minutes. The steps are read aloud and in common, and then people journal and share at the end of the meditation what they choose to share with the others in the group. But Genlin calls the underlying process holding and letting. You hold a situation and let a felt sense form, and that's a single process. So what that tells me is that the words we actually use, the word sequences we use to get to that space, can vary, as the Quaker sequence is quite different word-wise than typical focusing. Mind the light means turn inwards to the light within. That's short for the older expression of Christ within. Open your heart to the truth. Wait in the light. Hold and let. And submit to the truth. So for Quakers, what comes is not the felt sense, as Genlin's term, but rather the truth.
Mm-hmm.
The truth of what their life is and what it might be.
And so it's interesting because as somebody who has traveled through both journeys, you find that the experience is similar. So in that sense, it may also shed some light from the Quaker perspective into what the focusing experience is. In the Quaker tradition, you are experiencing it as the truth. And so maybe it sheds some light on the felt sense as something that we experience as true because it feels so right.
Exactly. Um, it's a spiritual truth that we're troubled by the current modern usage of truth. We tend to think of scientific truth, but yes, it's the truth of our lives as they are now, and holds open the possibility of as as to how we might change or what might come. The Quaker expression is opening. The truth uh, leads you to an opening, or more broadly, an opening of a way forward. And again, I think that fits well with Genlin's concept of life carrying forward as the underlying process that he talks about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that sense of opening to the process as opposed to blocking it.
Exactly, or getting or being stuck and remaining
Yes.
stuck. uh, I think I'd like, with that established, I think I'd like to move on to saying a little bit about what's different about the Quaker practice and uh,
Mm-hmm.
and focusing. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with Quaker practice, so I thought I might describe it briefly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, it arose about 370 years ago in Northwest England, and Quakers called them the Religious Society of Friends, or Friends of the Truth. And they meet then and now in what's called a silent meeting for an hour on Sunday, usually in the morning. And typical Quaker meeting, they meet in a circle, might be 20 to 40 people uh, in the meeting. If the space is small, it would be 2 or 3 concentric circles. The meeting process is deceptively simple. 4 or 5 people will come in before the start of meeting and space themselves around the circle and enter into a welcoming silence. The members will come in, and at the start of the meeting, it will take about 10 or 15 minutes before there's a deepening silence. This process is called centering down. And then at that point, or shortly thereafter, someone may rise to speak of a concern or an issue that they've been working with or troubled by. And the advice for speaking is to allow silence before speaking and after speaking, and to speak from a leading. So translated into the barest of terms, that means to try and speak from a felt sense. And this is what I think Genlin picked up on. Others may rise to speak again after an intervening silence. A theme may develop, or people may express different concerns. And then at the end of the meeting, the clerk of the meeting, at the end of the hour, will shake hands with the person next to him or her, and then may ask visitors to announce themselves. There may be a few meeting announcements, and then she or he will rise, and that signals the end of the meeting, called the rise of the meeting.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
want to just highlight something that I'm hearing from is that the meeting itself is focused on speaking from the felt sense, as opposed to a more standard discussion or other practice. And in order to ensure that this happens, there is a big amount of time that's devoted to silence, so that that creates the pause from which it is possible to access that felt sense.
Precisely. Um, so that silence acts as a bridge rather than a barrier. So it can actually facilitate um, the, uh, the speaking, especially if the speaking begins to resonate with other members and can lead them to examine the same issue or concern that they might have. The advice is to speak to the whole of the meeting rather than to individual members. So the focus is to try and speak from a leading that applies to all or can apply to all the members or the meeting as a whole.
Yeah, and so you used the phrase, the silence act as a bridge rather than a barrier. And so that sense of in ordinary conversation, we tend to quickly respond, and not having it might feel like a barrier, but actually in this case, it allows for everybody to process what's been happening and to put some of themselves, so that there is more obtained that way than if we were just following a quick um, statement, response, and
Yeah.
so on.
Actually, the Quakers have a phrase for that quick, off the top talking. They call them popcorn meetings.
Popcorn meetings, yes.
Just pop, 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 and that's not the idea.
Right, right.
So I want to go back through the meeting because, as I say, it's deceptively simple. But from an experience standpoint, the experience is, and this is a difference from focusing, not only do you have a feeling sense, let's say, of the other members in the meeting, but you have a feeling sense of the meeting as a whole. And in the meeting itself, you experience this sense of the meeting as sort of as a flow, particularly when the speaking resonates among members or touches them deeply. So I was trying to think of an analogy to when we talked today, and what came to me is listening to music, listening to a symphony. You can hear the symphony and you listen to the symphony as a whole, but you can also focus your attention on individual instruments or individual players. But the sense of the meeting, which is the Quaker phrase, is for that flow of the whole of the meeting. And often during meeting, you can sense when the flow is checked. Someone rises to speak and it doesn't quite fit, doesn't resonate. Or quite often towards the end of the meeting, people flag and their ability to listen lessens, and you can even see someone surreptitiously glance at their watch to see if the if the meeting's about to end. So the experience is of check and flow, of flow and check, and sort of the high point, which is not common at all, is when the meeting speaking rises to an occasion where the whole of the meeting experiences a felt sense and a felt shift forward. This is called a gathered meeting. It's rare, but when it happens, it's indelible. It's an experience that is retained both within the members and the meeting itself.
Yeah, yeah. So that sense of everybody and the whole meeting experiencing a felt shift.
Exactly. And this is called a gathered meeting. And for Quakers, this is where the term comes from. When Quakers get together, they call it a gathering, implying that that the meeting may always has the possibility of experiencing a gathered meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So, from this, there is sense of the value of what happens when people get together and create the setting for getting in touch with the truth in Quaker terms or the felt sense in focusing terms. And it's not just about each individual getting to that place, but the ultimate is when there is a collective sense of getting to that place in the
yes,
gathered meeting.
I'm not sure about the word collective.
Or a group experience.
I would say group experience.
Yeah. And so what it brings up is the sense that the spirituality is very related to that experience of getting individually to the felt sense and possibly getting to that group experience of a collective, a felt shift that people experience as a group.
Again, that's well said. I think that's a good summary.
And so the reason I'm going there is because that traditionally we think about religious activity as being in the presence of God. And in this case, the sense that that experience is a spiritual experience and might be perceived as the presence of God. And there's a link between the experience of the Quaker and the experience of focusers who might not have a spiritual motivation or seeking God, per se, but that there would be a similar experience under both settings.
True. Yes. That reflects my own view that speaking from a Quaker standpoint, any group could gather or can gather, and that would include a group of two in focusing.
Yes. and conversely, that the group of two in focusing is also engaged. We could put the meaning to it as it being a spiritual practice and in connecting with something larger than simply having a moment of connecting to some inner truth.
Yes. Yes. I think I'd like to take up another aspect of this felt sense of the meeting, and this occurs in the Quaker business meeting. This will probably is a more similar setting to group meetings that many of us have experienced. Once a month, the meeting gets gathers to have a business meeting. They discuss budgets and committee reports and make any decisions involved for the meeting itself. So it's called in the U.S. it's called the meeting for worship with the attention to business. I think the distinction is important because the form of the meeting is the same, although there's no set time limit. So again, 4 or 5 people will come in early, establish a welcoming silence, and then the members will assemble and again get into a deeper silence. It's called centering down, and then the meeting for business will start. The difference is it's led by the clerk of the meeting, which is an elected position, and the skill of the clerk, is quite central to the business meeting. He or she will set the agenda and lead the meeting through the agenda. The key skill of the clerk is to when a decision or an issue is in the offing that the meeting needs to decide, is to read the sense of the meeting. That is to get a sense of where the members stand, where the meeting is trending on an issue, and then to try and lead that process forward. In practice, that means trying to draw out the members as they express how they feel about a particular issue, to sort of collect the phrases and words that members speak, and then to try and develop what's called a trial minute, which is just an expression of the meaning that comes forward from different members speaking. If the issue is trending in a direction that will lead to a decision, then the clerk has captured the meaning of what the members have expressed, and then usually if you get the meaning right, the actual decision will fall out of that. In terms of Genlin, I think the key is, he calls this process explication. It's what we, when we have a felt sense, to try and get the meaning of our situation. This is developing the sort of our implicit understanding of the situation. In Quaker practice, this is actually a group explication process, so that by bits and pieces, the group forms a shared meaning of the situation at hand. And often then the decision follows. If the group shares a meaning or is united in a meaning of the situation, then normally the decision falls out. So you have a decision by the sense of the meeting.
So the
Go ahead.
that elected person has a role in capturing the sense of where people are, and it's called the sense of the meeting. Yes. And by articulating it then there is possibly a resonance where people feel, yeah, that's it. And then the decision then might be reached.
Exactly. It sort of falls out. If you get the meaning right, if you're united in your understanding of the situation, then normally the decision falls out fairly readily. And again, I think you focused on one of the keys to that process is the skill of the clerk in terms of reading the sense of the meeting, that is the members and the meeting as a whole. That's not always an easy process. In my book, I talk about one meeting that was held. The American Friends Service Committee is a volunteer service arm of Quakers. And in 1948, they had done refugee work in Europe. And after the Palestinian-Israeli war in 1947, they were approached by the United Nations to help feed and house the refugees in Gaza. There were about 750,000 refugees in Gaza. So the UN had asked the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, to look after those refugees. So at the committee meeting to discuss that offer, they went around the table, and each individual in turn said they thought it was something needed, but it was well beyond the capability of the service committee. After that round, the clerk of the meeting asked for 10 minutes of silence and reflection. At the end of that time, they went around again, and then each person in turn said, yes, that's something they ought to do and wanted to do and agreed to do. So what the clerk sensed was, despite the first go around, that there was an underlying unity and commitment to undertake the project. And so they did. So the skill is not only in reading the sense of the meeting, but in terms of trying to actually read or sense what's behind the words, because often there's a deeper.
Yeah. So in ordinary life, what we tend to do is argue and bring arguments, pros and cons. And in that case, it's about making the space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people sometimes confuse consensus with sense of the meeting, but Quakers, I think, are quick to point out that a sense of the meeting, a decision by the sense of the group is a step beyond.
Yeah.
In consensus, they're often just niggling differences that you give up, and those tend to break down over time. Whereas a decision by the sense of the meeting tends to stick.
Just being in contact with the larger factor, the larger dynamic, something that's going to have more power to go beyond the little differences.
Yes, it has the power to stick, and people then, if it calls for action, then people will commit to actually seeing it through. Yes,
So what you're describing is that, in that case, there was that 10-minute moment, for people
exactly.
to reconsider. But in the first phase, when people talk, is there a silence between each person talking, as in a regular Quaker meeting?
Yes. Um, the advice is the same to allow silence before speaking, allow silence afterwards, to speak from a leading, and speak to the whole of the meeting.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's one of the key differences. People look at outside people have looked at Quaker practice, and again, it seems deceptively simple. Oh, we just make decisions by sense of the group, but that's often without the discipline of what you describe, which is the pausing in the silence before and after
And I would
speaking.
add that, so there is, of course, that pause, there is that skill to be able to orient that. But I think there is also the fact that this is deeply ingrained in the group culture because it's also part of the spiritual practice and of the weekly practice. So it's not something that people put on just for a sensitive meeting, but it's a way of life and a way of being together in a group.
Again, well said. Um, um, yes, and that's not easily replicated. Um, to develop the trust and sort of the deep listening that goes into the environment that allows that um, uh, ability or the prospect of a felt sense forming.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So that seems like might be a good place to end. I want to just check if you feel like you want to add something else.
yeah, thank you for that. That that was a that is a good ending point for me. But what I wanted to say is what we've talked about today is only one of the two group settings that I have worked out. The second one is actually takes place is a group setting in U.S. prisons. Um, in the 1970s, Quakers were approached in New York by inmates at Green Heaven Prison to put together a program or a project to reduce violence in U.S. prisons. And they did that with something they called an Alternatives to Violence project. So in this case, what the Quakers developed with the inmates was a gathering, you could call it a gathering practice, adapted to the prison setting, to working with inmates. So the same Quakers were with the inmates were able to create an environment again where a felt sense can form and change and transformation can take place. And this is without the religious language, uh, but it's possible, um, as the AVP shows, um, to develop these skills, listening skills, and trust that allows the process to go forward. So
Mhm.
it's not in any sense dependent solely on Quakers or Quaker practice.
Yeah.
This this is now a voluntary uh, group active in the U.S. and abroad in prisons, and it's about 40 years old. So again, I think I would end by saying that it's possible for any group to gather. So,
Yes.
all right.
Thanks, Harbert.